give them, rather rebuke them, reproof them, and then then you won't carry sin upon you. I thought that this was a really interesting and different way, an interrelational and interpersonal way to enter into the conversation and to shift the conversation so that students are able to actually grow as people, to learn about themselves, to learn about others, to have deeper conversations, and not just like get caught up in, you're an anti-Semite, you're an anti-Zionist, you're horrible, you're horrible, you're horrible. And that just continued to go on campus. And I think that this pedagogy is actually a way of sidestepping it. So I'm going to turn it over to Yoshi to describe his pedagogy, and then I'll go a little deeper into some of the things that I learned along the way and what the pedagogy actually is. Yoshi?
Thanks, Ari. So my background in terms of pedagogy and Jewish education is primarily in sort of broadly embodied Jewish practice, which includes a number of different things of music and movement and breath work. But I've spent particularly a decade and a half doing Jewish food farming and outdoor environmental education. So really working in the Jewish nature connection space. And I remember, with Molly. And so I remember as I was just getting into that work, I'd be with some, master interpretive educators and nature educators, and they would just be constantly giving us just these like tips and tricks, tools of the trade, right? Which become, I think they're important in all spaces, but when we're sort of out in the woods or in the mountains or wherever it is, become sort of like, felt like that much more important, or at least that much more pronounced in terms of the need. So things like you're outside, it's a bright sunny day, don't stand with your back to the sun because the kids will be looking at you and they'll be blinded, right? Or like there's, you're outside, there's like an eagle is flying by, right? Like pause, because it's really cool. That's kind of why you're out there. Let everybody look at the eagle, have the moment, and then go back to whatever you're teaching or whatever the activity is, right? Whereas, as opposed to like trying to just like push through the distraction, right? Sometimes you just need to like lean into it and pause. Or you're with the kids on the trail, right? And you need to like take a break, right? Is there anywhere to comfortably sit? Right? Can the kids like gather in sort of a cluster, or is the trail really narrow and they're going to be spread all the way around, right? Like, so there's the combination of like, as you're thinking about your whole trail day and you're moving through all of these different spaces, you sort of plan your route and the activities and everything with all of those different spaces in mind of like, okay, we'll take a break here. I know there's this really cool spot here, right? And so that's the sort of prescriptive things when you're thinking about how am I going to prepare my lesson plan, our trail time, all of that. And then, of course, there's the things that are responsive to what's happening in the moment of like the eagle flying by, or a kid notices something that like they want to stop and see, right? Everyone's really tired and you just need to stop right there or find the best next best place, right? So like all those things really shaped my, I think, worldview in terms of thinking about that relationship to all of the dynamics of space and the content and the students and all of those things. So as I was distilling this into a pedagogy, I wanted to think like across lots of different places, right? What are the ways in which we can apply those in different contexts? And how do we really have that particularly Jewish sense of the relationship to place? I'm just going to share this. There's a few different aspects of the resource we'll talk more about later, but I'll share just this one. So I broke these into two categories: makom kavua, which is prescribed positionality, and makom nora, which is emergent positionality. So makom kavua is thinking about as you're setting up the space, whatever that space is, whether it's an indoor classroom or an outdoor space or whatever, how do we sort of think about different typologies that come from Jewish tradition that can inform what those spaces look like and what are the dynamics? So I have three main typologies that I use. The first is hakafot, which are circle variations. And again, this is like anyone who's taught much, right, or led groups, so it's like sitting in a circle is not exactly like revelatory, but it's thinking like what's under the surface, like what is a circle good for, when should we use it, when is it not appropriate, right? And sort of how do we think about where that sort of emerges from Jewish tradition? So we have hakafot, we have the bima as a typology. So this is for when everyone is like, you want everyone to basically look at the same thing, right? So this is like really good for performances and lectures postures, and things like that, where you may not want to sit in a circle because actually it makes it harder to have that full experience. And then finally, Beit Midrash, which is that clustered group learning, right? Where you have small groups, you want lots of dialogue and engagement happening within that. You don't want a lot of competing voices, right? It requires a lot of self-direction. And knowing which of these to use when, right? So like if everyone's sitting in that Beit Midrash cluster, but you've got one person speaking at the front of the room, do you have like half of the students having to like turn around in their chair? That's fine for like 30 seconds, but if that's for 10 minutes, that gets really uncomfortable, right? So how do we really set up the spaces so that they're gonna really go with our learning goals? And then there's the emergence, right? So no matter how well we set things up, things are gonna happen in the moment that we're gonna need to be responsive to. So for this, I used 3 archetypes, again, from Jewish narrative. It's really thinking about what are the ways that we can sort of respond in the moment using some sort of like embodied practices and relationships to place. So the first is Yaakov, and thinking about the moment when Yaakov wakes up from this dream, says like, wow, I was in this amazing sacred space. I'm going to change that physical space. I'm going to take this stone and put it as a pillar, and I'm going to anoint it. So changing the physical space, which we sort of did with Shira before, I'm going to like, change it up. The second is the Miriam moment. So this is thinking about like after crossing the Sea of Reeds, right? Like what did the people need? They needed this like celebratory music. So Miriam was right there ready with her timbrel, right? And like took it away. And then the final one here is Moses or Moshe. And so this is calling from the burning bush moment where Moshe pauses and slows down and takes that sort of step back to notice what was happening in the moment, which takes that slowing down and that time. So thinking like maybe there's something happening, but it requires that we just take that step back and create some time and space to sort of be in the moment as it's happening. So to full screen. So Ari, I'm going to toss it back to you. Thinking about we've actually probably got 2 minutes or so before we should go into some Q&A. But just sort of, I'd love to hear more about what was sort of interesting and maybe challenging for you going through the last, it's 10 months, right, from that we've been in this process of distilling the pedagogy and working with the cohort. Like, what was that journey like for you?
Yeah, thanks, Yoshi. I would say that one of the really interesting learnings was actually just going down and really doing research on sort of like the verse and thinking about this through a pedagogical lens. So one of the first things I noticed, so I always thought that the verse in Leviticus 19 has 3 clauses. The first clause is, do not hate your fellow in your heart, rather reprove them so you don't have sin. And I always thought that the way the verse was read, and the main rabbinic thrust in reading this is that you will you will bear sin if that person continues in their like iniquity, right? So like if this person is, to take a sort of an orthodox example, you see someone eating a piece of pork and you don't go ahead and say, you shouldn't eat pork, then that sin, you have some of that sin on your account, right? And that person has to change. The movement of change actually happens within that other person. Right, so in this person, you're like, in this way, you're sort of like, on the morality police, right? So taken back into the campus climate, it's really the idea that I had coming in is that maybe you could enter in conversation, you could learn a bit about them, and maybe you could try moving away so that you no longer hate them, so you could understand where they're coming from. But sort of like the shift might be to try convincing them. And then when I went in and sort of like looked deeper in the Jewish tradition, I saw that the sort of another way of understanding the verse, which is probably the pshat, the simple literal reading, is actually like, you shouldn't hate someone. And how do you not hate someone? You have to actually talk to them. And if you do that, then you will be removing the sin of hatred from you, right? All of the movement takes place in the agent, in the I, in myself. And sort of like going a little deeper, the idea is that difference is good, and difference is actually like, something that's really positive. And sort of like this whole pedagogy actually revolves in coming in with like a beginner's mind and actually trying to really listen. And as I sort of did the research, I saw that there's this whole tradition that actually says like, that's actually how you have to go ahead and and do rebuke. Rebuke isn't actually about changing anyone, right? It's actually about changing yourself. And, and the goal of it is so that you don't hate them, not because they change, but that you actually transform who you are as a person. So taking that, and I see we're running out of time, I built out a pedagogy of a number of conversations that a staff person or a mentor could have with the participant who's engaged in these ideological battles, and really focusing in on a number of different conversations, right? The sort of the meta conversation of like, how do you understand the tension between these three clauses in the verse? Don't hate your fellow, reprove, rebuke them, and you shouldn't bear sin because of that. A second level of conversation, which I distilled from Hilchot Deot in Maimonides, Laws of Opinions, where he sort of gives an ethics of how to go ahead and have that conversation, right? To speak, to come in not charged, right? It's easy to, when you're arguing about something that's deeply personal, to start yelling and to and take no prisoners approach. Actually, there's an ethics of actually how you have the conversation, to listen, to be empathetic, to be open, and then finally to ask the question of what type of conversation are you having? Are you having a factual one? Israel was created in 1948, not 1948, or are you really having an identity conversation? And we created a whole number of cards that an educator could use to actually have those type of conversations of how do you understand the verse, and sort of the why at the core of it. How do you have the conversation, and then what type of conversation do you have?
Sorry, so I'll maybe pick it up for just a couple of thoughts, and then we'll open up for any questions. I'm just thinking, right, the context of this breakout is visibility, and it's sort of interesting. I think on the surface, our pedagogies arguably don't have that much in common, but there's this deeper level of how our pedagogy is contributing to seeing somebody, right, and seeing really where they're coming from. And I think for me, a lot of what I was thinking about is, how am I moving my body as the educator in relationship to the bodies of the students, right? And sort of what are the dynamics that come into place, right? Do I want to be towering over them if they're little, right? Or do I want to get down to their level? Like I said, if they're constantly turning, that's just not comfortable, right? So how do I put myself in what's going to set them up to be able to be, engaged and involved? And in my paper, the sort of Dvar, words of Torah and anecdote that I close with is this beautiful teaching. And I don't remember exactly from whom I heard it, but this teaching stayed with me. And it's responding to this moment where, again, Moses is demanding to see God, to look at God, and God's like, that you can't do that, you'll die. And Moses keeps on insisting, and God finally says okay, you can see my back, right? Hide in this cave and I'll pass by and you can see my back. So the sort of interpretation that I heard from that, and of course there's a lot of different ones, but this one stuck with me, which is what was the beauty of God allowing that for Moses, which is if you think about positioning yourself so that you're looking at someone's back, right? So you're behind them and they're right here. What actually does that mean? It means that not only are you looking at their back, you're actually looking over their shoulder in a way that you can see the world from their perspective. So the beauty of that moment was God allowed Moses to have this moment of seeing the world from God's perspective, which you can imagine how amazing that would be. So I think if we're thinking about that in this sense of visibility and seeing our students, our learners, our participants, what does it mean to sort of see the world from their perspective and in a physical choreographed way to place ourselves in a way such that we can set that up for them. So with that, we've got about 5 minutes before the breakout rooms close. So we'd love to hear from folks. Questions, please come off mute, or you can also pop them in the chat.
I'm sorry, I just have one logistical message, if that's okay. Sorry to take you out of this headspace. Josh, can you please send the 2 photos of the previous drawings to Emily? Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
Resume.
Give it a little more wait time. We can also just keep chatting, me and I.
curious. Sorry, I'm not a plant, but I am curious to know for either of you, if this pedagogy is really successful, like what's the change that it would do? Like, and how would you see it with your learners?
I can start. I think I mean, one of the nicknames, for us is like Jews are the people of the book, and for good reason. And I love how much wisdom there is encoded in our texts. But I think the downside, the drawback of that sometimes is that we can go into an overly intellectual, heady space, right? And so, of course, a lot of my work is bringing that into the body. But I think it goes into this case of like thinking about just recognizing, right, that like students are they're not just heads. Right? It's like full bodies of people, and we have different needs, and like we're affected by the ways that we are, relating to place, and that, and relating to each other. And so I think for me, I think having fewer spaces where students are sort of like only, where are like, what's the word I'm looking for? There's the word, whatever, but they're deconstructed, like not allowed to be their whole selves, right? They're only bringing in like their heads, so to speak. So they're only their ideas, or only the extent to which they can regurgitate knowledge or whatever it may be, right? But being able to bring in their full physical selves, which then leads into their full emotional, mental selves, their backgrounds, history, lineage, identity, like all of those things. I think if we're really opening ourselves up to recognizing the entirety of who our students are and creating spaces that really honor and recognize that, then they'll just be more full, whole, complete spaces.
So one of the things for that, Yoshi, one of the things that I actually learned also, maybe just to go back to the previous question in this process, is actually how it impacted myself, right? So while I was doing this, there were a couple of times where I was in conflict with people, and I'm like, I'm doing all this work with M squared. Maybe I should apply it to myself, and maybe I should just pause it to actually just enter into open conversation with them. Right, and to try changing myself, and sort of I think that's the change that I'm seeking to manifest in the campus community, because really this is about having difficult conversations. This is about interpersonal relationships writ large, right? I'm focusing it on a certain segment of the population that I work with, but it's just so important. We're in such a polarized space in America, in the world, where people are just yelling at each other. They're just constantly yelling at each other, and they're hating each other, right? And I think if we took this pedagogy seriously, we could move out of that space. We could move out of the space from trying to erase difference, to erase the face of the other, which is, I think, maybe another moment connection to visibility, because this is about actually trying to reanimate the face of the other, reanimate who the other person is, to actually listen to them, to say, hey, we might have differences, but let's continue to be in civil discourse, in civil conversation. But I think this actually takes it a step further, and to actually say, not only let's be let's have civility with each other, but let's actually try to move to understanding. And it's actually interesting that the Gemara, when it talks about tochacha, it says that tochacha leads, there's actually disagreement, right? Tochacha leads to peace, and then another sage says that actually tochacha leads to love. Right. And I think that that's sort of the move, right? I think it's almost like two steps, halavai, at least we could get to the place where if we actually embody tochacha in our communities, we could get to a place where there's shalom, there's peace. But I think that there's actually, if we really take this seriously, we'll actually move from hate to love. It reminds me of that great Martin Luther King Jr. quote, that hate cannot drive out hate, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only love could do that. So I thought when our sages said years ago that tocha leads to love, it's really meaningful, and I think that's the change I'm looking for.